From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The consequences of indefinite detention cannot be understated. They can cause severe and lasting physical and psychological damage that rise to the level of torture. At Guantánamo, the overriding hopelessness is presenting a health crisis that must be addressed before Guantánamo becomes, in the words of Adnan Latif, and I quote you, a piece of hell that kills everything.
Over 100 men at Guantánamo have reportedly entered their fifth week of a hunger strike against deteriorating conditions. This comes as the Obama administration goes before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights defending its treatment of prisoners held at Guantánamo. A number of prisoners have been held without charge for over 11 years. More than half have been cleared for release. Then the fight against Citizens United.
On the day of the Citizens United ruling, we at freespeechforpeople.org and others called for this amendment to overrule Citizens United and to make clear that people, not corporations, shall govern in America.
We'll host a debate between two critics of Citizens United on how best to challenge the landmark ruling that opened the floodgates of corporate money in elections. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodmore. More than 100 detainees held in the U.S. military prison at Guantánamo are reportedly entering their fifth week of a hunger strike sparked by deteriorating conditions. News of the hunger strike first emerged last week, but it appears the action involves far more prisoners than previously thought. The unrest comes as U.S. military officials have confirmed a guard fired rubber bullets at detainees in January for the first time in prison's history. We'll have more on Guantánamo after headlines. Afghan President Hamid Karzai says his government plans to take full control of the Bagram prison from the U.S. by next week. The U.S. military has stalled the transfer amidst disputes over Karzai's vow to hold trials and release innocent prisoners. Speaking at a gathering of tribal elders in Helmand province, Karzai urged public support for a standoff with the United States.
I am sure you are all aware of the arguments about the Bagram prison handover. I urge you all to stand with me and say that Karzai is right, and we want to take responsibility of the prison, and those who are innocent should be released. God willing, this demand will be implemented practically by Saturday or Sunday next week.
The CIA is reportedly increasing its operations inside Iraq. According to the Wall Street Journal, CIA operatives are replacing U.S. military forces and working with Iraq's counterterrorism service. The purported aim is to help fight al-Qaeda in Iraq and prevent a spillover from Syria's internal conflict. The CIA's role in the Middle East appears to be expanding overall. The agency is operating a drone base in Saudi Arabia and training Syrian rebels in Jordan. A new report is warning Syria's children are perhaps the greatest victims of their country's civil war. The group Save the Children says more than 2 million Syrian children are facing disease, malnutrition, severe trauma, and early marriage from 2 years of unrelenting conflict. Studies of Syrian children in refugee camps found high incidences of physical abuse and of experiencing the death of a family member. At the United Nations, Patrick McCormick of the children's agency UNICEF warned a generation of Syrian youth are at risk.
Millions of children inside Syria and across the region are witnessing their past and their future disappear amidst the rubble and destruction of this prolonged conflict. We must rescue them from the brink for their sake and for the sake of Syria and future generations.
According to Save the Children, increasing numbers of children are being recruited by armed groups on both sides. Child recruits have been used as porters, guards, informers, fighters, and even human shields. A top United Nations investigator is accusing Iran of a systemic and systematic crackdown on human rights. In a report to the UN Human Rights Council, UN Rapporteur Ahmad Shahid said Iran has employed torture and other abuses in order to stifle dissent.
A majority of human rights defenders, including those that defend the rights of women, religious and ethnic minorities, as well as those that work to advance protections for the environment, workers and children, continue to be subjected to harassment, arrest, interrogation and torture, and are frequently charged with vaguely defined national security crimes, which is seemingly meant to erode the front line of human rights defense in the country. My current report also presents what appears to be unimpeachable forensic evidence that torture is occurring in Iran on a geographically widespread and systemic basis.
Shadid says Iran spared the lives of at least a dozen people after their plight drew international attention, suggesting the Iranian government is responsive to global pressure. Iran has dismissed the report as, quote, a compilation of unfounded allegations initiated by the United States and its European allies. Israeli forces have killed another Palestinian in the occupied West Bank. 25-year-old Mahmoud Titi was among a group of people fired on by Israeli forces during a raid near the city of Hebron. A witness said the soldiers opened fire after being hit by rocks.
Suddenly, the soldiers raided the refugee camp in 3 vehicles, and you know how it will be in the camp. So the youth started to throw stones, and the soldiers opened fire randomly. They fired tear gas grenades and fired at the houses and at everything that was moving in the camp.
The Palestinian Authority says Titi was the 6th Palestinian killed by the Israeli occupation force in the West Bank this year. 8 other Palestinians were wounded in the attack. President Obama is due to visit the region a week from today. Tensions between the United States and Venezuelan governments are flaring 1 week after the death of Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. The Obama administration's expelled 2 Venezuelan diplomats, in apparent retaliation for Venezuela's expulsion of 2 U.S. military attachés last week. The attachés were accused of planning to destabilize Venezuela. On Tuesday, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Elias Jawa renewed the claim, accusing the U.S. of plotting to topple Chavez before his death. Argentina's last dictator, Ronaldo Bignone, has been given a new life sentence over the kidnappings and disappearances of political opponents and the deliberate theft of babies from political prisoners. Bignone and 2 other defendants were convicted Tuesday for crimes at the Campo de Mayo, a military base used by the dictatorship during its rule from 1976 to 1983. The 3 are already serving jail sentences for other abuses under their military regime. He is currently being tried in another case focusing on Operation Condor, a coordinated effort by Latin American military rulers to target their political opponents in the 70s and 80s. The nation's top intelligence officials are warning cyber attacks from abroad now pose a greater threat to national security than al-Qaeda and other militant groups. For the first time ever, an annual review of threats to the United States lists the risk of foreign computer attacks on the networks of U.S. infrastructure and institutions higher than terrorism, organized crime, and weapons of mass destruction. Director of National Intelligence James Clapper discussed the finding in testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee.
When it comes to distinct threat areas, our statement this year leads with cyber, and it's hard to overemphasize its significance. Increasingly, state and non-state actors are gaining and using cyber expertise. They apply cyber techniques and capabilities to achieve strategic objectives by gathering sensitive information from public and private sector entities, controlling the content and flow of information, and challenging perceived adversaries in cyberspace. These capabilities put all sectors of our country at risk.
In response, the Pentagon's new Cyber Command has unveiled plans to create 13 offensive teams to counter computer attacks from overseas by the fall of 2015. The teams would be used for cyber operations against foreign countries linked to computer attacks on the United States. The Senate Judiciary has advanced 2 new gun violence measures to the Senate floor. The measures would expand background checks to private gun sales and create a task force on improving safety at schools. A vote on the most contentious gun control measure among Washington lawmakers, banning assault weapons, was postponed. A 6-month-old baby girl shot in a drive-by attack in Chicago has died of her wounds. Janila Watkins and her father were shot on Monday afternoon while he was changing her diaper in a parked minivan. The baby underwent surgery overnight but died Tuesday morning. Her father remains hospitalized in critical condition. A spokesperson for the family, Reverend Corey Brooks, said, quote, "The city of Chicago should be outraged that in our city, a 6-month-old baby could be shot and killed." A witness to the police shooting of an African-American teenager in Brooklyn, New York, is challenging the New York City Police Department's claim he was armed. 16-year-old Kamani Gray was walking down a street in the neighborhood of East Flatbush when 2 plainclothes officers followed him in an unmarked car. The officers got out to approach Gray and opened fire when they claimed they saw him reach for a gun in his waistband. But speaking to the New York Daily News, a Brooklyn woman who watched the shooting from her window said Gray never had a gun in his hand. Police say they recovered a gun next to Gray's body. On Wednesday night, supporters held a protest in Brooklyn for the 2nd consecutive night to denounce Gray's killing. Community organizer Fatima Shakur was among the speakers to address the crowd.
Kamani Gray was only 16 years old. Parents should not bury their children. Police brutality is not decreasing, it's increasing. So I need to hear your power is in your voice. We don't gotta bash nobody's stores or nothing like that. We more better than that. But your voice is your weapon. Kamani Gray doesn't have no voice no more. We have to be his voice.
Tuesday's protest was peaceful after several stores were vandalized following a rally the day before. New York City Council member and community activist Charles Barron said the killing of Kamani Gray has triggered anger over the marginalization of African Americans.
People are angry and frustrated. We're living in poverty. We're living in unemployment. In the richest country in the history of the planet Earth, we have poverty that equals Egypt's poverty that caused the revolution. And then to have these police officers using deadly force to take the lives of our children, our youth out here, it's just unacceptable. So this is the least that the community could do, is to respond and resist. We always got to resist. We always got to provide vehicles that allow for the ventilation of our anger. And we must resist until we can figure out a strategy for victory.
Colorado is set to legalize same-sex civil unions following final approval by the State House. Democratic Governor John Hickenlooper has vowed to sign the measure into law. It would take effect on May 1st. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. More than 100 detainees held in the U.S. military prison at Guantánamo Bay, Cuba, are reportedly entering their 5th week of a hunger strike against deteriorating conditions. News of the unrest comes as U.S. military officials have confirmed a guard fired rubber bullets at detainees in January for the first time in the prison's history. The incident took place on a soccer field for cooperative captives when authorities say a detainee sought the attention of a guard in a watchtower who controlled a gate leading to a pathway back to the prison. The detainee allegedly tried to scale the fence. Meanwhile, more information about the ongoing hunger strike has begun to trickle out in letters from detainees. Some say Arabic interpreters have searched their Qurans in ways that constitute desecration according to their religious beliefs. Others report guards have been taking away detainee possessions.
Yemeni detainee Bashir al-Marwala wrote in a letter to his lawyer, quote, "We're in danger. One of the soldiers fired on one of the brothers a month ago. Before that, they send the emergency forces with M16 weapons into one of the brothers' cell blocks. Now they want to return us to the darkest days under Bush. They said this to us. Please do something," he wrote. Lawyers for the detainees say some prisoners who've refused to eat for weeks in protest are now coughing up blood and losing consciousness. For more, we're joined by Pardis Kibrai, senior staff attorney with the Center for Constitutional Rights. She spoke last Thursday with her client, Ghalib El-Bihani, who is one of the hunger strikers. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you tell us what he said? We now hear that well over 100 of the 166 prisoners are on this hunger strike.
He said what we've heard from every other detainee who has communicated with his lawyer since February, which is that there is a large-scale hunger strike in Camp 6, which is the largest of the facilities at Guantánamo. That prison holds about 130 men. He said that almost everyone except for a few who are sick and elderly are on strike. He himself had lost over 20 pounds. He is a diabetic. His blood glucose levels are fluctuating wildly. He told me that medical staff at Guantánamo have told him his life is in danger, and he and others want us to get the word out about this. We last week, CCR and a group of other habeas counsel wrote a letter to the authorities at Guantánamo and to the Department of Justice reporting what we have heard and asking for a response. And to date, almost 2 weeks later, we have not heard anything other than denials of the strike.
How is it that Guantánamo spokesperson is saying that there are only 5 or 6 people on hunger strike?
That's right. They have downplayed the scale of the strikes and have said that there are only a handful on strike and only a handful being tube-fed. It may be a matter of semantics. The way that Guantánamo authorities define people on hunger strike is largely discretionary. But what we have heard from every habeas counsel who has been down to the base or communicated with their clients since February is the same, which is that there is a large-scale strike. Men are refusing food. We've heard reports of people losing over 20, 30, 40 pounds, and we're now today in day 36 or so of the strike. By day 42, 45, you start seeing things like loss of vision, loss of hearing, and eventually death. So it's an emergency situation. We view it as an emergency situation, and denials by the authorities at this point of the strike are dangerous and irresponsible.
Pardis, can you tell us about your client who told you about this hunger strike?
He is a young man from Yemen. He's one of 89 Yemenis. They make up the largest group of men at Guantánamo. There are 166 people who remain. He, and like everyone else from Yemen, even if he were cleared to leave Guantánamo, which most of the men at Guantánamo now are cleared by the Obama administration to leave, he would be stuck there. He would remain imprisoned because of a continuing moratorium on all transfers to Yemen. He's one of many men who has, at this point, lost a great deal of hope about when his detention at Guantánamo will ever end. He's never been charged. He's been held now for over 11 years.
For over 11 years without charge.
Over 11 years without charge.
How many men are in a similar circumstance? 166 are there. More than half have been cleared for release, just aren't being released.
There are 166 men. 86 of them have been cleared by the Obama administration to leave. That means that every government agency with a stake in Guantánamo has unanimously declared that those people do not need to continue to be held. Most of the men who are cleared are Yemeni. There are 56 Yemenis who are cleared. There's a handful of other men who could leave but need resettlement in third countries. So that is who we're talking about at Guantánamo. There's a small number of people, about 34, whom the government has said it ever plans to charge. The rest are not people that the government plans to ever charge, and most, as we've said, have been cleared to leave.
So can you explain, though, Pardis, why, after so many years, why are conditions now deteriorating to such an extent that these men have decided to go on hunger strike? What's prompted that?
Well, the literal trigger that we've heard about is searches of the men's Qurans, which they view as religious desecration.
But why now? What was happening in the last few years?
The motivation is unclear to us. There's been a change in personnel at Guantánamo that may have triggered it. This is against a broader background. We've heard of regressive practices more recently. But I think what it can't be divorced from is the fact of 11 plus years of detention, and a sense of extreme desperation, extreme hope, men who have seen their fellow prisoners die over the past few years, men who were told by President Obama in 2009 that the prison would close within a year. So that is the context we're talking about, and a provocation like searches of the Qurans is severe enough, but I think it's not disconnected from the broader context at Guantánamo.
We're going to go to a break and then come back to this discussion. Our guest is Pardis Kabriai, and she is with the Center for Constitutional Rights, represents one of the prisoners at Guantanamo. We have word that perhaps more than 100 of them are on a hunger strike, for some of them at this point life-threatening. When we come back, we're also going to talk about the case that's before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and speak with the lawyer who represented detainees at Guantanamo and testified at that hearing. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We continue now with our look at detainees held indefinitely at the U.S. military prison in Guantánamo Bay, Cuba, as we turn to a hearing that took place Tuesday before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Attorneys for the prisoners warned the lack of hope for release among those who do not face charges has created a climate of despair. This is Center for Constitutional Rights attorney Omar Farah speaking before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, D.C.
I represent Tariq Bauda, for example. He's a young Yemeni man who's been on an uninterrupted hunger strike since February 2007. He's force-fed daily by Guantanamo guard staff. In fact, as we speak, it's likely that he's being removed from his cell, strapped to a restraint chair, and a rubber tube is being inserted into his nose to pump a liquid dietary supplement into his stomach. Quite simply, Tariq says this is the only way that he has to communicate to those of us who have our freedom what it means to be unjustly detained, to be put in a cell for a decade without charge. It's his only way to, in fact, communicate the barbarism of such conduct. So I'd like to conclude by addressing the state directly. In light of the moral challenge that Tariq Bauda and the other prisoners at Guantanamo present, in light of the existential torment that indefinite detention creates for Guantanamo prisoners and the physical risks that it poses, in light of the fact that the state itself has conceded that more than half of the prisoners the state no longer has an interest in detaining through the clearances that my colleague just described, in light of the fact that 9 prisoners have died at Guantanamo in U.S. custody, and after 11 years, when is enough enough?
That was Center for Constitutional Rights attorney Omar Farah speaking Tuesday at a hearing before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Well, U.S. State Department official Michael Williams also testified at the hearing. The senior advisor for Guantanamo policy countered that the Obama administration is working within restrictions imposed by Congress to transfer prisoners out of the prison as part of an effort to close the facility, one of the president's original campaign promises.
The U.S. government continues to stand by its decisions to designate certain detainees for transfer subject to appropriate security measures. We have transferred 71 of those individuals, including the resettlement of 40 detainees in third countries in cases where the U.S. government identified humane treatment or related concerns in the individual's country of origin. There are 56 individuals designated for transfer who remain at Guantanamo. Each potential transfer is individually assessed, as was the practice of the administration prior to the legislative restrictions, to examine whether appropriate security measures can be taken in the receiving country to mitigate the potential security threat the transferred individual may pose.
Michael Williams, State Department. Well, for more, we're joined by Christine Husky, Director of the Anti-Torture Program for Physicians for Human Rights and adjunct professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. She also testified. She was one of the first attorneys to represent Guantanamo detainees and is the author of Justice at Guantanamo, One Woman's Odyssey and Her Crusade for Human Rights. Also still with us is Pardis Kabriai, senior staff attorney for the Center for Constitutional Rights. Her client is one of the Guantanamo prisoners who's on hunger strike at the moment. Let's turn to Christine. Tell us what you said yesterday.
Well, I addressed on behalf of my organization, Physicians for Human Rights, which uses medicine and science to advocate for human rights. I was addressing the psychological and physical consequences of indefinite detention at Guantanamo. So, for example, as Pardis said, I think the hunger strike and the intrusion into religious practices really is sort of a trigger point in the context of a much larger problem, which is the indefinite detention that's going on at Guantanamo. And in this situation, you have severe and lasting psychological trauma. And this is caused by chronic states of stress, anxiety, and dread, because essentially these people at Guantanamo don't know if they're going to be released, if ever. They don't know if they're going to be charged. They know some people will be charged, but yet not everyone who might be charged has been charged. They don't know if they're ever going to see their family again. Now, it's been over 10 years, and you have people who left their children who were, young toddlers. They're now young teenagers, and they have no, way of knowing whether they should cut those ties and tell their family to forget about them or try to keep those ties. And they have extremely irregular contact with their families. So all of this uncertainty and uncontrollability causes extreme stress on the immune system, the cardiovascular system. It leads to asthma, diabetes, gastrointestinal disorders, spread of cancer, viral infections, hypertension, depression, suicide, PTSD. So, yesterday the the United States testified as to the great care and hospital facilities and beds and primary care providers. But that all does not negate the psychological trauma caused by this indefinite detention, which in this case really is sort of the epitome of indefinite, because who knows when the war against terrorism will ever end.
Well, Michael Williams, the State Department official who testified at the hearing yesterday, said during his testimony that Guantanamo detainees, in fact, do not face indefinite detention.
The United States only detains individuals when that detention is lawful, and does not intend to hold any individual longer than necessary. For instance, in 2010, following the application of the suspension of transfers to Yemen, the U.S. government did transfer a Yemeni detainee from Guantanamo to Yemen after he was ordered released by a U.S. federal court pursuant to his petition for a writ of habeas corpus. The U.S. government is acutely aware that the majority of detainees at Guantanamo are Yemeni nationals, and recognizes the need to identify solutions for that population as part of our broader transfer efforts.
Christine, that was Michael Williams of the State Department testifying Tuesday. Could you comment on what he said about indefinite detention?
Yeah, well, I think it's a bit of an outright lie to say that they're not being held in indefinite detention. As I just mentioned, they're claiming the right to hold these men until the war on terrorism is over, until the hostilities have ended. The hostilities, they claim, are against al-Qaeda and associated forces. So realistically, what does that mean? It could mean 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it could mean never. Maybe we'll always have terrorism. I suspect we will. I'm sorry, that's just an unrealistic view of what that means. Guantanamo is the epitome of indefinite detention, as is this sort of war on terrorism.
Pardis Kabriai, if I was wondering if you can weigh in here on that.
I'd like to know what he might say to the situation of our client Jamel Amezian, who's an Algerian man who's been cleared by the Obama administration, has been cleared for years and remains imprisoned at Guantanamo because he needs a third country to be resettled in. So a statement that, you know, we don't hold people unlawfully and we're holding people pursuant to the law is just completely inconsistent with what we know of who's being held right now.
And could you also explain, Pardees, what is the problem with repatriating the Yemeni nationals, the majority of prisoners in Guantanamo, and also this client about whom you spoke from Algeria? Why can't they return to their countries of origin?
Well, the men from Yemen, many of them want to return, and the problem is a moratorium imposed by President Obama, and then restrictions now enacted by Congress in 2011 and that have been extended until the present. Those restrictions have nothing to do with the individual circumstances of individual Yemeni people at Guantanamo. They have to do with a blanket ban on people on their return to their home countries because of their country of origin. It has nothing to do with individual circumstances. So the problem has really been set up by President Obama and now Congress. That doesn't mean those problems are insurmountable. President Obama, if there's political will, there will be a way. The administration has said that it intends to close Guantanamo, that it is still committed to that, and it still can do that. I have a Yemeni client who was transferred days before the moratorium went into effect. He was cleared. There are 56 Yemenis like him who are cleared, who are at Guantanamo. Their detention is absolutely arbitrary. They should be sent back, just like my client, except he was on the lucky side of the moratorium.
I want to go to something else Michael Williams said, again, the State Department senior advisor for Guantanamo policy, describing the medical facilities for prisoners during his testimony before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights yesterday.
The detention facilities joint medical group providers administer care to all detainees at Guantanamo. This includes psychological services and care specific to a detainee's age group. Detainees are treated at dedicated medical facilities with expert medical staff. The medical facilities are equipped with 30 inpatient beds, a physical therapy area, an audiology booth, optometry exam room, dental treatment suites, an operating room, pharmacy, radiology, and central sterilization. Navy hospital corpsmen visit each cell block daily. Upon the request of any detainee for care, these corpsmen can refer them to primary care providers in this joint medical group. In addition to providing routine medical care, more serious medical conditions can be treated at the U.S. Naval Hospital at Guantanamo, which provides care to U.S. service members at the base. Additional specialists are available from outside the base to provide care at Guantanamo for medical needs that exceed the capabilities of the U.S. Naval Hospital at Guantanamo. Medical services are available to detainees around the clock, 7 days a week, and all detainees must provide informed consent for any procedures.
That was Michael Williams, the State Department senior advisor for Guantanamo policy, describing the medical facilities for the prisoners during his testimony at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Christine Husky, if you could respond to that. And also talk about one of the men that you represented named Obaidullah.
Absolutely. Well, as Commissioner Robinson recognized yesterday during the hearing, all the beds in the world and the nice ophthalmologists and, primary care providers does not negate the psychological toll that the men are enduring. And in particular, the men who have been cleared for release. Imagine knowing that that you have not been found to be dangerous, that you should go home, that you could go home, and it's really just a matter of political will. So that does not negate that. And certainly, I don't undermine the medical care or the facilities or the level of care. Certainly, there's psychological care there. But we're talking about a group of men who, for the first several years, were tortured and abused in many cases, and that is not in dispute. Neither is in dispute the complicity of many of the healthcare professionals who were down at Guantanamo in the early years. There's clear records of doctors withholding medication dedication to make prisoners cooperative in interrogations. There's evidence of doctors being there during interrogations, waterboarding and all that. So we're talking, again, this is all in a history and a context of what has gone on at Guantanamo in the last decade. So, you know, the standard of care requires a trusting therapeutic relationship with your between the individual and the therapist in order to overcome some of those psychological traumas. And at Guantanamo, that's just not going to happen. There's clear evidence that the detainees there don't trust their doctors, don't trust the psychologists. So again, you have this ongoing situation of severe trauma, psychological trauma that in some cases rises to the level of torture and inhumane treatment. On the other hand, you don't have a downright restriction on transferring detainees out of Guantanamo. You have difficulties, you have hurdles, you have obstacles. So, you know, I want to say to President Obama, you know, buckle down and do the work. I know it's going to be hard, but it was done before. In transferring prisoners out of Guantanamo before 2011, there were negotiations with countries. You got assurances that the detainee would not create a threat. That was all done before the National Defense Authorization Act, and it can be done now. I think that Congress is being used as a cover, and the administration needs to step up and do the hard work.
And Obaidallah?
Oh yes, sorry. This is a terrible situation. Mr. Obaidallah was, is an Afghan citizen. He was taken when he was 18 or 19. His daughter was just a week old. She's now 10. He really, you know, he was never even accused of being of targeting U.S. forces or you know, committing any hostilities. He's accused of having landmines in his buried in his home, which evidence later showed, you know, there's over 10 million landmines in Afghanistan due to the previous civil war there. So even if you believe the allegations against him, there's no evidence that that he has a present threat or present danger against the United States. And his case, the court even said there's no evidence of that. It's just that we think he's Al-Qaeda, or I believe that he's Al-Qaeda. So his case now is, if you can find that I'm a present threat against the United States, then maybe you have some reason to hold me. But now they're holding men like my current or former client, Mr. Obaidallah, that there's not even a determination that they constitute a present threat, like the Yemenis. Mr. Obaidallah is now on hunger strike, and in the first 3 weeks of his hunger strike, he lost 15 pounds. And he, you know, again, he's protesting the intrusion into his religious practices and his, you know, the desecration of his Quran. But that's really just a trigger point for the entire situation, which is ongoing indefinite detention and the hopelessness that the detainees feel there.
Christine Husky, very quickly before we conclude, one of the arguments made by the State Department official and other government representatives here in the U.S. is that the National Defense Authorization Act has made it, NDAA, has made it more difficult for Guantanamo detainees to be released. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, you know, as I referenced earlier, it's maybe it's made it a bit more difficult, but really all it means is that the executive branch has to do a little bit of work. They have to, you know, get a national security waiver. But as I mentioned, the truth is the transfers that occurred before, those negotiations with other countries, the administration obtained assurances, the same kind of assurances that are required in the NDAA, that the detainee who was being transferred would not, you know, present a threat. And I have a former client in Portugal who, for the first several years of his being there after his transfer, the Portuguese government surveilled him. They kept tabs on him. He had to check in. He was transferred before the National Defense Authorization Act was passed. That's the same sort of thing that the Act requires. So it's not that much more of a burden now. And I think it really is just a political cover.
Pardis Kabri, last question. That is, you say if they had a will, there would be a way. What is exactly the way that you see President Obama can move forward? He said one of his first acts when he became president in 2009 was he would close Guantanamo. He says he's stopped by Congress. How do you see it happening?
I think it starts with starting targeted repatriations and resettlements of the people who everyone agrees do not belong at Guantanamo. As Christine said, there are congressional restrictions in place, they're not insurmountable. There can be certifications that waive those restrictions. So those resettlements and repatriations are possible. They can happen in a targeted way. And we're talking about a group of people who the administration and we and everyone agrees do not belong at Guantanamo. So start there.
We want to thank you both for being with us, and of course we'll continue to cover this issue. Pardis Kabriai, a senior staff attorney with Center for Constitutional Rights. Her client, Ghalib El-Bahani, is one of the Guantanamo prisoners on hunger strike. We believe more than 100 of the 166 prisoners, perhaps close to all, are striking right now. Christine Husky is with us from Washington, director of the Anti-Torture Program for Physicians for Human Rights, adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, one of the first attorneys to represent Guantanamo prisoners, author of Justice at Guantanamo, One Woman's Odyssey and Her Crusade for Human Rights. She testified yesterday at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, a debate on different strategies to challenge money in politics. Stay with us.
Disappears somehow. I've got beer money, you've got champagne. If you don't stop spending, I'll go insane. I need money, give it to you, honey. Daddy, I need money now. Daddy, I need money now.
Laverne Baker, Money Blues. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to the movement to challenge corporate personhood, the notion that corporations have equal rights to individuals. On Tuesday, Independent Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Democratic Congressman Ted Deutsch of Florida introduced the Democracy is for People Amendment, which seeks to overturn the Supreme Court's 2010 landmark Citizens United case. In a 5-4 vote, the court ruled corporations have First Amendment rights and that the government cannot impose restrictions on their political speech. This cleared the way for corporations and other special interest groups to spend unlimited amounts of money on elections. The proposed amendment states that only natural persons can financially influence the outcome of public elections. If enacted, the amendment would completely prohibit for-profit corporations, non-profit organizations, and unions from making expenditures in elections. Congressman Deutsch said in a statement, quote, "The Democracy is for People Amendment will stop corporations and their front groups from using their profits and dark money donations to influence our elections while reaffirming the right of the American people to elections that are fair and representatives that are accountable."
Meanwhile, state legislatures of North Carolina, West Virginia, New Hampshire have introduced resolutions condemning Citizens United. All three resolutions call on Congress to pass a constitutional amendment to reverse the 2010 decision and limiting money in politics. However, not all critics of the Citizens United ruling believe the amendment movement is a fruitful endeavor. Mark Schmidt wrote in the New Republic that the amendment movement, quote, undermines progress on other solutions, including public financing improvements and corporate governance to give shareholders more say in political contributions, disclosure improvements, and better enforcement of existing laws by both Federal Election Commission and the Internal Revenue Service, quote. Well, for more, we're hosting a debate with two critics of Citizens United on opposite ends of the amendment issue. In Washington, Mark Schmidt's with us, the senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and former former editor of the American Prospect. Here in New York, we're joined by John Boniface, a constitutional attorney, co-founder and director of Free Speech for People. He's helped lead the amendment efforts. Mark and John, we welcome you both to Democracy Now! Well, why don't we start with John? Lay out why it is you're pushing this amendment and where it stands in the country right now.
Sure. Well, you know, Amy, when we launched this campaign the day of the Citizens United ruling, there were plenty of skeptics who thought it couldn't be built. This movement wouldn't have any staying power. It was too difficult. And I think we've proven with our allies in the field, Common Cause, Public Citizen, People for the American Way, Move to Amend, and many others, that those skeptics are now wrong. 11 states are on record calling for a constitutional amendment, 500-plus cities and towns across the country. Members of Congress, business leaders, religious leaders, and the President of the United States have all come out in support of this. And we need this amendment because the only way to overturn a United States Supreme Court ruling is through a constitutional amendment or waiting for a new majority of the Supreme Court to do so. And the people understand in this country that the Supreme Court is wrong on this basic question. Corporations are not people. They do not breathe. They do not think. They do not have a conscience. They're artificial entities that we create, and people should govern over corporations, not the other way around.
And so the constitutional amendment says exactly what?
Well, there are various proposals out there, but there are two major problems that the constitutional amendment needs to address. First, it needs to address the point that Congress and the states shall have the authority to limit overall campaign spending and campaign contributions. This dates back to a 1976 ruling, Buckley v. Vallejo, which equated money with speech and set forth this system of unlimited campaign spending we have today. The other problem is the problem of corporations being treated as people under the Constitution. These corporations argue in court cases after court cases that they, in fact, have the rights of people, natural persons, and those arguments are being used to strike down public interest laws protecting our environment, our health care, consumer rights, civil rights, and now our elections. And we need to address both problems via these amendment bills.
So, Mark Schmidt, can you explain why it is that you're opposed to efforts at a constitutional amendment?
Sure, and I'm glad to be here. I've always viewed. I'm not surprised that the constitutional amendment has caught on. I wasn't the kind of skeptic that John describes. I think it's easy to describe. I think it's easy to get people to sign a petition for it because it sounds very clear cut. I view it as a real distraction from some real progress that we can make on money in politics, because while you can build a movement around there are like 17 different versions of the amendment, while you could build a movement around this concept, the message it sends is we can't do anything until we have a constitutional amendment, and under the current circumstances, we can't do anything until we have a constitutional amendment is exactly the same as saying we can't do anything. And so I think that's just sending the wrong signal to people and overlooking the tremendous progress that's actually being made, which John knows because he was there at the birth of it, really, on public financing that offsets the role of big money from individuals and big money from corporations, which really are not dramatically different, whether Sheldon Adelson writes money as an individual or through his corporate entity. It really doesn't matter all that much, but we can offset that money with good public financing, such as in New York City, Arizona, Connecticut. These systems are popular, they're resilient, they withstand legal challenges, and that's really where the energy ought to be focused at this point.
But why can't, Mark Schmidt, why can't these efforts take place in conjunction with an effort to push through the constitutional amendment?
Well, as long as, to the extent that you're making clear that you don't need the constitutional amendment to make some progress, it's not the worst thing in the world. A lot of it depends on which amendment it is. I don't have a problem with an amendment that overturns Buckley v. Vallejo and says that we can limit overall spending on a campaign as well as contributions. The corporate personhood issue is a lot more complicated. I mean, a simple example of it is John works for an organization called Free Speech for the People, Incorporated. It's a corporation. Corporations are how we organize everything in American society. It's how political parties are incorporated. It's really the form of organization we use. And at some level, I work for a corporation. Many of these corporations are actually organized for the purpose of political speech.
So in a sense,
so I think it's a pretty big leap, and goes way beyond what actually happened in Citizens United, in which corporate personhood is a very tangential concept to Citizens United.
So in a sense, John, you work for the man, because if a corporation is a person and you work for a corporation, well, I guess for the man or the woman. But, well, what do you think is wrong with what Mark's saying, that these other efforts would be more productive?
Well, first let me say that there's a lot that Mark and I agree on. I mean, public funding of elections is a critical reform, and I couldn't agree more that needs to happen as well. Where we may disagree is the idea that somehow these are not complementary efforts. In fact, a constitutional amendment campaign which returns the country to the first principal question of what we are as a nation, is it we the people or we the corporations, can help propel these other kinds of important reforms. So I am a longstanding advocate for public funding of elections. I believe in it. But the Citizens United ruling has set us on a course which allows these artificial entities to now spend unlimited amounts of corporate dollars into our elections, undermining any public funding system. We need both efforts to go forward. As for the point that Free Speech for People, Inc. Is a corporation that somehow should have free speech rights, it's just antithetical to what the framers intended, what our Constitution is about. I'm a natural person, you're a natural person, Nermeen's a natural person, Mark's a natural person, but these corporate entities are not natural persons.
Why are they bestowed with this?
Well, this is an artificial creation, really, of corporate America over the past 30 years in the most recent era to undermine the First Amendment and the Constitution. The argument being made that these entities need to have free speech rights alongside natural persons. But, you know, the point here is that the members of Free Speech for People Incorporated, the supporters, all have constitutional rights. Nothing's going to be changed by these constitutional amendments on that point. What will be changed is restoring democracy to the people, making clear that we govern over corporations, not the other way around.
John, can you also respond to what Mark Schmidt said about there being something like 17 versions of this amendment?
Well, look, we're at an early stage in the drafting of this amendment language. The key thing that has to be done here is to build a broad grassroots movement for this amendment, and we're more than a quarter of the way there, with over 11 states on record. It takes 38 states to ratify, and now many members of Congress coming forward. We support Congressman McGovern's amendment bills that he's introduced, the People's Rights Amendment, H.J. Res. 21, and the amendment we call the Political Equality Amendment, H.J. Res. 20, which would deal with these two basic problems, unlimited campaign spending and the problem, the fabricated doctrine of corporate constitutional rights. But we're not at the point now where we have to all come together behind one specific language. What we really need to do here is build this broad movement, which is being built. And as you said in the opening, there are many other states where these resolutions are advancing. Again, this propels other reforms, including public funding of elections, transparency, shareholder approval. We need this vibrant democracy movement if we're going to protect the promise of American self-government of, for, and by the people.
In unveiling his Democracy is for People amendment, Florida Democratic Congressman Ted Deutsch said, quote, any constitutional amendment that simply gives Congress the option of regulating campaign finance fails to immediately achieve what the American people want, and that is a complete reversal of Citizens United and other Supreme Court decisions that have allowed corporations and the wealthy few to drown out the voices of everyday voters. John Boniface.
I think it's an important new introduction, another amendment bill that needs to be put forward and debated in the Congress. But again, we really have to build this from the states, and that's the work that's happening today.
Mark Schmidt, can you also respond to the comments that Florida Congressman Ted Deutsch made, and also elaborate a little on what kind of campaign finance reform you think is plausible and should be pursued?
Sure. I think, Citizens United was wrongly decided. It went way beyond even the question that was before the court, without even requiring any of the issues related to corporate personhood. I think we've made a lot of progress in this. We're really undergoing a grand experiment with how much we can do with public financing of elections, and I think we're beginning to find that those systems that either provide provide a fixed amount of money to candidates who agree to forego most private money, or that match small contributions like New York's system of the 6-to-1 match, or the system in Minnesota that's been defunded, but while it was there was a tax credit. So essentially you got a fully refundable tax credit. So essentially you got like a free $50 every citizen to contribute to campaigns. That those can really help candidates get to the point of being heard without turning to big money, and get them enough that they're not necessarily shot down by big money. So that has to be, I think, the biggest priority. And I don't think that, I don't want to send any signal that you require a full reversal of Citizens United in order to make progress on those grounds, because you really don't. And there are at least 2 or 3 bills in Congress, such as Senator John Sarbanes' Grassroots Democracy Act, that can begin to move in this direction. I would hope we'd have a change in the tide at the court. There are 5 members in that Citizens United majority. I think 2 of them are in their 70s, one of them in his 60s. The odds are not bad that President Obama or the next Democratic president will have an opportunity to remake that majority. The 4 who are in the Citizens United minority hold it very strongly. Those 4 don't, if their position prevailed, you certainly don't need a constitutional amendment to do that. So I think that there's reason to hope that the Supreme Court could shift without this very, very, actually quite sweeping amendment that I don't really know what happens after a full corporations aren't people amendment. I don't know what happens to the rights of organized groups like Free Speech for People Incorporated after that. I think it's a weird area.
Well, the rights are protected by the Constitution, as they always have been. The individual rights is what's at stake here, not the corporate rights that there's a fabrication. But let me just address the point about movement on the court. There's a good historical example of how a constitutional amendment can help move a court. The poll tax, which as we know is a fee charged to voters in order to vote, was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1937 and again in 1951. And then in the heat of the civil rights movement came Annie Harper, a poor Virginia voter, and other Virginia voters with her, challenging the poll tax for the 3rd time. Virginia v. Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections. By the time they got to the Supreme Court in 1966, the poll tax amendment, the 24th Amendment to the Constitution, had been enacted in 1964, barring poll taxes in federal elections. That case, dealing with poll taxes in state elections, got before the Supreme Court 2 years later, and the Supreme Court finally reversed those prior 2 rulings. So amendment campaigns and amendment movements are critical for pushing back in the courts as well. I agree we should push back in the courts, but I don't think we need to do any one of these things in isolation. They all go together.
And explain how your organizing is going around the country, how you organize for a constitutional amendment. I mean, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, went down, though there was tremendous momentum for it at a time.
Yeah, well, first of all, the Equal Rights Amendment went down only because there was an artificial 7-year time restriction placed on getting it ratified. 35 states ratified the ERA. Carolyn Maloney, Congresswoman from New York, has introduced repeatedly a bill to remove that time restriction, allow the remaining 3 states to ratify. We're not putting any 7-year time restriction on these amendment bills. We understand it can take more.
Who puts the restriction?
Congress, when they passed the amendment bill, put the restriction on the ERA. But the ERA very quickly got to 35 states ratifying, and then time ran out, again, on an artificial basis. But the way we're organizing this is, as other organizing movements have done, working with people at the grassroots level, our coalition partners, state-based partners, local organizations, as well as elected officials, leaders in those communities, to pass resolutions at the local level, county level, state level, and really to generate the galvanizing kind of momentum that's needed to show Congress that they must act. We're not going to get there necessarily this year or the next year, but we believe that over the next several years there will be enough states on record showing Congress that they must act, while all these other important efforts go forward to reform and defend our democracy.
Mark Schmidt, your comments before we conclude?
Well, sure. I mean, I think the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, is actually a wonderful example of how a constitutional amendment movement, even apart from actually ratifying the constitutional amendment, can kind of galvanize a whole range of efforts. And while that was proceeding, the women's rights movement, the feminist movement, was making enormous gains both in the workplace, state government, state laws, federal laws, and the culture as a whole, with that as an organizing principle. And I think something like, for example, a constitutional amendment on the right to guaranteeing the right to vote would be a similar great organizing tool, and you could do a lot of things kind of in its wake while you waited for that right to be fully established. Those are what I call yes we can amendments. They really give you a lot of room underneath them to organize. The various amendments here are, for the most part, kind of no we can't amendments. They send the message you can't make the big gains that really matter until you've passed this constitutional amendment, exactly as Congressman Deutsch said, which really isn't the case. So it's a very misleading message that these 17 or whatever amendments send. That's quite different from ERA or poll tax.
John, that this could hurt the cause?
We're not hearing that message. The message we're hearing from people all around the country is they want to stand up to lift up the promise of American democracy, of government of, for, and by the people. That's the message that's going across this country.
Well, John Boniface, I want to thank you for being with us, Director of Free Speech for People, and Mark Schmidt, Senior Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and former editor of the American Prospect. That does it for the show. If you'd like to read transcripts, tweet it out. Just tell your friends about Democracy Now! Go to democracynow.org. Democracy Now! is produced by Mike Kirkland, Nick Elsa, Martin Ermishek, Steve Martinez, Sam Alcoff, Hani Masood, Rabbi Karen, Dina Gesder, Amy Littlefield, Martinez Torres, Danima Allen. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Decker